Hello, my name's Doug Balfour. I'm a pianist and an arranger, and I have been a music director on occasion. Um, I started off as my first love in music was classical music, Beethoven and Chopin and Debussy and the whole standard retinue, and it's still my great love. But along the way, I played in rock and roll bands, in Dixieland bands, and wedding bands, and any kind of conventional commercial band you can think of. When I was about 24, I came back from England, and I was working with a duo which had a female singer in it named Brenda Camino. And Brenda Camino one day asked me if I would like to work with a friend of hers, Frank Rufo, who was putting together a music theater review to go into the Cambridge Motor Hotel. And at the time, I said sure. And I met with Frank, and he talked to me, and he seemed like a really fun fellow and just very positive and a lot of great ideas. So I wound up taking the job, and that's how I got involved with music theater. And at first, it was a bit of a shock for me because I was auditioning people and meeting actors, and I knew nothing about this. I didn't have a clue about music theater. And I was learning as I went along, and we would put arrangements together. I remember our first show was Flashback Follies of the Roaring 90s, or the 90s, or the turn of the century. It was kind of a ragtime sort of show. And we created on-the-spot arrangements, and sometimes it was a lot of fun. Sometimes it was frustrating because I was having to learn new skills, like how to teach things to people that barely read music or weren't used to it. And everybody was probably very frustrated with working with me, too. But we got through it, and then I did a second show, Flashback Follies of the Roaring Twenties, and that was a lot of fun. And then I went back to touring with a band called the Frigidaires after that, and I didn't really work in theater for a number of years. But I still maintained a close friendship with a lot of people from the Cambridge Motor Hotel, and I still heard from Frank, and occasionally I'd go in to sub on one of his shows there. But then years later, I wound up working with a show, Pump Boys and Dinettes, at the Charlottetown Festival. And then I started getting gigs, music directing shows. I did a couple of John Gray shows, and along the way, I wound up playing piano for Forever Plaid in Toronto for 2.5 years. And then playing in orchestra pits for shows like Sunset Boulevard and Phantom of the Opera I did that for about 10 years. And in recent years, I've music directed and put tracks together for a couple of Jim Betts shows and that sort of thing. And I still get the odd call, but the main thing I still have is the friendship I have of the people I've worked with along the way. And most of them are the good friends that I made at the Cambridge Motor Hotel. And thank you to Frank Rufo for that wonderful opportunity. And I'm sure more will come along as I'm going along. As I'm getting older here, I still enjoy doing it.
Hi, my name is Aysun, and I would like to share some stories about working at dinner theater many moons ago with Flashback Follies. I did 2 shows with them, one with the Roaring Twenties, and one was the original Flashback Follies of the gay 90s. We worked under the wonderful leadership of A. Frank Rufo and Bob Ainsley, and the story I'd like to share today is about Bob Ainsley. I also want to make a note that I've made friends with so many people during the time with that show that remain with me today, my friends today, and that's more than 40 years ago. So one day we were marking dance steps for the next show. I think it was for the Roaring Twenties. And I had gotten to a little bit of an argument with one of the other actors. And so I was doing a little drama queen BS during rehearsal. And Bob said, Aysun, could I speak to you? And he took me aside. And he said, I just want you to know you're one of the strongest personalities in the show. And I thought, oh, that's quite a compliment. He said, so that means that when you're up and positive, everything is terrific and it's quite contagious. He said, however, when you're in a terrible mood like you are today, that's also contagious. And it brings the whole level of the whole rehearsal down. And I need you to pull on your big girl pants, be professional, straighten up your attitude, and go out there with a positive attitude. And I thought, okay, well, I will do that. But I'll tell you, at first, I was nonplussed, but I have taken that lesson with me today to bring the best attitude you can into any situation, because it's only going to be to the good. So thank you, Mr. Bob Ainsley.
That certain night, the night we met, there was magic abroad in the air. There were angels dining at the Ritz, and a nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. I don't know if I heard Frank sing that song, but we heard Mary sing it. Anyway, this is about Frank, isn't it? I love Frank. Oh my God, Frank is family. Frank and I had a tumultuous start while he was he was into the gay 90s. Is that what they called that show? I was thinking about that going, did they really do that? And did they get away with that? Because that was the early 80s, wasn't it? Possibly the late 70s that he started, because I met Frank, maybe I met Frank before I moved to Toronto. That's very possible, actually. Went to see his show. I was at first, I think, taken aback with how Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, how Rat Pack he was. And that was where I met him, at the Cambridge Motor Hotel. The stories must be many at this point. Well, it's just one of those songs that you hear now and then. You don't know just why and you don't know just when. It's one of those songs that starts playing and then it's one of those songs that starts playing again. Oh my God, that's the song. That is the song. That was the song. I think that was song. Oh, it's time. I'll get to that. It was a song that opened, I think, did it open all of the... I'm trying to remember if that's the song we used in the 40s. It was the song we used in the 20s, for sure. So I met Frank when he was doing the 90s show, which is when I met Aysun and David and Karen, Pam, and, oh, what was her name? She wasn't around for the 20s. Anyway, Brian Coatsworth. Met a bunch of people. Early on, I was young. I think I was as young as 17 when I first met them. And by the time I was 18, I was working there. And my entry into the Moho world was facilitated by Kimberly Timlock, because when I first auditioned for Frank, pardon me, I did a horrible audition. It was a horrible audition. Doug Balfour could probably attest to that. It was really sad. I didn't work with any, I was 17 or 18 years old. Didn't work with anybody. It was so cocky. Anyway, walked in totally cold and tried to sing losing my mind. Ugh, the youth and the young. The young, somebody's wasting something there. The youth and young. There's all kinds of wastage. Anyway, Frank was like in his 40s, and I was like 18, and he was an asshole to me. He was a total asshole. So he didn't hire me, and then Kimberly hired me while he was away in Muskoka or something, and then he comes back, and he's livid. He's livid. And by that time, God bless Kimberly. God bless. She was really kind of like, God bless. Yeah. Anyway, I was a puppy. I was such a puppy. I did not realize at the time, but I was such a puppy. Anyways, so I get into the show during the 20 show, and I'm kind of, by the time Frank shows up, I'm pulling my weight, but I'm not sparkling very much, but I'm pulling my weight. Then the 1940 show, they start rehearsing it, and I think there was a period of time where Frank was like, I need you to step up your pussy. Or, he didn't say that, but I like that expression. But that was the message. And I don't know what I did, but somewhere along the line, during the 40s show, I gained Frank's respect and my self-respect as well. And Frank and I, that's the bonding. I mean, the bonding began at the beginning, but it was hilarious. And I'm sure there were a couple of times he was after my ass, and I was just like that was the line. Like, we didn't have that relationship at all. We drank way too much. We smoked way too much. Ugh. So I would stay at his place. I stayed at his place on Seton. I stayed at his place on Paisley, like for days at a time. When I was traveling around Europe in the mid-90s, when I came back, I stayed at his place. He was away, like in the Muskokas or something at the time. I stayed at his place at that time. Frank, I miss him. If he was of sound mind, he and I would do this probably a lot. We'd probably Zoom like crazy. We were like doing Zoom like shit as soon as it was possible. He and I, we hung out in the 80s. He and I, we used to, when I worked for the city of Toronto in the rent control office, the Toronto office, and on Fridays sometimes I would make an excuse to get out of the office at like 2 or 3, usually 3, and Frank and I would meet, and we'd go to, I think it was called Colby's, and they had strippers on already, and just like Frank and I, and nobody else, and strippers, and we would drink, and by 7 o'clock we were like, I gotta go home. We'd be so drunk. And there were a couple of times where we did that, and then we'd call each other up at like 10:30 and go, let's go out again. We did that too. And we'd go out dancing. I mean, there was a place, 101, was it 101 Sherburne? That was a place I would meet Frank on a Wednesday. Yeah. My memories of Frank are all clubbing. We did a lot of clubbing, but we also shows. So I was in many Moho shows. I was in 20s, 40s, Yankees, Gypsy. I worked Follow Spot for Oklahoma. There was something else in there too, I think. Anyway, I had a blast. And Frank and I also worked in, was I on that? Yeah, Music Man. I was certainly on that. Sudbury, Music Man. Grand Bend, Gypsy. That was fun. That was lots of fun. Rainbow Stage. That was The Wizard of Oz. Again, lots of fun. Oh, Frank taught me to drive. It was a drive between Toronto and Winnipeg. He was like, here, I'm going to teach you to drive in this parking lot. He's like, okay, yeah, and it was standard. Okay, shift and clutch and shift and all of that and getting through, and then, okay, turn here, turn there, turn there, and then suddenly I'm on the highway. He's like, keep going. And, and that's how I learned to drive standard. Or a part of it. Oh, Frank. Yeah. Oh, love you, Frank. Love you so hard.
Hi, I'm Scott Hurst, and I've been asked to share a few stories about the Moho. In 1980, I was cast in the very first show directed by A. Frank Ruffo at the Showplace Dinner Theatre at the Cambridge Motor Hotel, a place that affectionately became known as the Moho. Unfortunately, also at the same time, I was cast as a replacement in a production of the Wild, 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 Wild Mad West show being produced at the Seaway Motor Hotel by Sears and Switzer. Now, at the Moho, everybody had to wait tables as well as perform in the show, whereas at the Seaway Motor Hotel, only the women had to wait on tables. So much for equality. So I bowed out of the Moho show after only one rehearsal because I was so afraid of waiting tables, and I'll admit it, the drive out to Martin Grove and Dixon seemed 3 times more daunting than the drive out to Lakeshore Boulevard and the Kingsway. When I broke the news to Frank, he said to me with the most deadpan of faces, "You'll never work for me again, kid." And then he burst into the biggest of smiles and he said, "I'm only kidding, Scott." Luckily, Frank was true to his word, and eventually I did get to work with him on stage in a tribute to Guys and Dolls in the fall of 1983 and the winter of 1984. At the Moho, we only worked 4 nights a week, so I was back in St. Catharines one weekend visiting my parents when the phone rang. It was another person to whom I'm deeply indebted, Ann Wooten, who told me that they were about to start rehearsals for the musical Duty in Edmonton, and they'd lost someone, and did I want to replace them? So, once again, I phoned Frank and asked him if I could have someone take my place on 3 days' notice. Never one to hold his kids back, Frank simply said, "Take the offer, we'll manage, go." And off I went to do my first equity gig. Incidentally, during Guys and Dolls, I did have to wait tables. And after managing 1 table, and then 2 tables that included a dine and dash, they threw me into the deep end, and I was soon pushing bruschetta and cork balls with the best of them. Thank you, Frank. And Ma Potter, and Marilyn, and Garth, and Katie, Nobody Loves a Fat Girl When She's 40, Murtaugh. How lucky we were to be Frank's kids at the Moho. And is it just me, or did $150 a week buy a heck of a lot more in 1980? Thank you.